right, now we're going to be on page 116 of our notes. And we've just talked about what's known as innate behaviors or instinctive behaviors that animals automatically know how to do. They already know how to act that way, and that's because of the genes that they've inherited. But today we're going to focus on learned behaviors, and some of these are going to look very familiar to you. But when you think of a learned behavior, you want to keep in mind that this is going to require practice. Okay? Animals will have to practice learned behaviors to be able to perfect it or master that behavior. So unlike the spider spinning a web, this is going to be very different. These are going to be things that take some time for the animals to be able to do. The first type of learned behavior that we'll talk about is called habituation. And this is actually when you stop a behavior. When you halt, that means you're stopping a behavior. And that's going to be because there is no reward or no punishment. Okay? This is a type of learning that basically means you require some sort of motivation. One example of habituation is if you live by the train tracks. If you live by the train tracks, you first moved there. The first couple nights that the train goes by and you hear the wheels turning on the tracks and you hear the bell or the horn going, you might wake up and you might kind of stay awake for a while because you're not used to that noise. But eventually, you're going to get used to that noise and you'll just sleep through the night and not notice it anymore. The second type of learning is known as trial and error learning. In trial and error learning, this is also known as operant conditioning. Operant conditioning. This is where an animal is actually going to improve whatever skill that they're learning, such as going through a maze. A lot of times you'll see this with mice. If you put a piece of cheese at the end of the maze and they eventually find that piece of cheese, if you keep putting that piece of cheese in the same spot, then they're going to learn faster how to get there. And eventually it'll take them no time at all to learn to get through the maze to get the piece of cheese that they want. So here you have two types of learned behaviors: habituation, making something a habit because there's no reward or benefit, okay, or reward or punishment. And then you have operant learning, okay? So you have to kind of operate or practice going through there, trial and error. Then we have what's known as classical conditioning. And a lot of you, especially that have been in psychology already, will find this very familiar. In operant conditioning, you're associating two different stimuli. When you're associating something, you're pairing them or you're making a connection between them. Okay. So associate meaning to make a connection between two things that are not usually related. Your main example is with Pavlov and his dog. What the scientist did was he fed his dog, and anytime the dog saw food, it would kind of start to salivate, kind of drool a little. But then he started to ring a bell, and then he fed his dog. Rang the bell, fed his dog. And eventually what would happen is if he rang the bell, the dog would start drooling. Why? Well, it was expecting the food. And so classical conditioning, you're relating two things that aren't usually related, and you're making a connection to them. So the dog thought that every time he heard the bell, now he would get food. And we'll actually see another really fun example of this in class, but you do need to understand classical conditioning. You're making a connection between two things that are not related or that usually don't go together. Next, we have a combination of our innate and learned behaviors. Most behaviors in animals are going to be combination. You had to have the instinct to do it, but then you also learn to do it better. One of your first examples of a combination of innate and learned behaviors is called imprinting. Imprinting is the first step to learning the behavior of your species. This is usually the urge to follow or copy another organism. Big example of this is your goose and your goslings, okay, the baby goose. Usually a baby goose will actually follow the first thing that it sees moving. So, for example, if you set a little remote control car beside a hatching goose after the goose actually hatches, and you run the little remote control car around, the goose would actually follow the remote control car. Eventually, it should learn that that's not the right thing to follow, and it'll stop following that. The second type of combination behavior is communication. So imagine a baby crying, eventually learning how to say a few words, and then later on having a conversation like you and I can. So communication is a combination of the innate urge and the learned method. Another example of communication besides using sight, like the waggle dance in bees, seeing each other do a dance in a specific pattern, or sound, like with humans, okay? And although we also communicate with some sight as well, some of the hand gestures and facial expressions that we do. But other animals can also use chemicals known as pheromones to communicate. This can help them find food. This can also help them find a mate. And we'll actually see an example of this with ants in class. Example is the honeybee waggle dance. This is an example of insects communicating with each other. Bees will actually do a waggle dance to sometimes help them find a mate. Other times it's actually going to help them find food. If you're a forager, that means you go and look for food. You search for food. And a lot of times a bee will do a very specific loop or dance to show you what direction the food can be found in. So the other foragers in that colony can actually go find that food. We'll also see an example of this in class as well. But these are all of the behaviors that we need to know. You need to know the names of the different behaviors and understand examples of how animals perform that behavior. Make sure that you keep in mind that we want to think about how does this behavior act as an adaptation to help an animal survive. And that's all for today.